Furlough fears were widely exaggerated. The reality is that life goes on. The economy continues to grow, and people are still out there working hard to make sure you get food on the table in time for dinner tonight. Yes, it's not perfect out there, but it's also nowhere near as bad as many of us were expecting. In this video, the latest UK unemployment and employment figures, what really happened when the furlough scheme came to an end recently, and why we should all prepare for a real terms pay cut over the next 8 months. When the furlough scheme finally ended in September, there were widespread fears about the potential damage to the UK labour market. Would many of those employees who were still on furlough at the end of September be made redundant? It was a reasonable question to ask at the time. After all, nobody knew for sure what decisions employers were making behind the scenes. We knew that more than 1 million employees were still on furlough as that scheme drew to a close, 1.1 million by all estimates. It was reasonable to assume that not all of them would return to work, and perhaps several 100,000 people would ultimately join the dole queue. However, the latest jobs data suggests that the end of furlough did not spark a new labour market shock. Payrolled employment has continued to rise, vacancy levels have reached a new high, and a new survey finds that 7 in 8 recently furloughed workers have actually returned to work. This assessment of the latest Office for National Statistics ONS data from the Resolution Foundation paints a fairly positive picture of the UK labour market as we approach the end of the year. The Foundation notes that when the furlough scheme ended on the 30th of September, there was rising employment, reaching 75.4%. And at the same time, levels of unemployment fell to 4.3%. And a record number of people moved into new jobs, a move not driven by redundancies, but by resignations. They're joining this great resignation, which I'll talk about in just a moment. So when viewed using a more volatile single-month measure, unemployment was recorded at 3.9%. That's still below its level from February 2020, before the pandemic got started. We should stick with this massive number of people moving jobs then for a moment. 2.2 million people in the UK started a new job between July and September. That's according to official data from the ONS. And that's massive. It's a sign of what's being called across the pond in the US the Great Resignation. It's a widespread trend of a record number of workers leaving their jobs since the start of the pandemic. You might have heard of it called the Big Quit, and it's happening in the US, it's happening here in the UK, it's happening all over the world. Now, we know from US data that the Great Resignation is the most significant for mid-career employees. That's people aged between 30 and 45. Before the pandemic, job turnover was always highest for younger people, younger employees, but that trend has been largely reversed since last March. Resignation rates for older workers, people 60 to 70-year-olds, also appear to be falling. So it's really those mid-career workers who are resigning, moving to new roles. A shift to remote working practices could be one driver behind the Great Resignation. If employers feel it's riskier to hire younger, less experienced workers because they wouldn't be able to offer in-person training and mentoring as easily, that would create more demand for mid-career employees, people who are already skilled and experienced. It's also possible that these mid-career employees, the 30 to 45-year-olds, had enough of their current roles, and during the pandemic they finally decided to jack it in for a new role, possibly one with better pay or a more accommodating work environment. Now, looking specifically at the UK economy, early signs for the UK labour market post-furlough look pretty encouraging. Payrolled employment rose by 160,000 in October, and vacancy levels reached this new record high, 1.17 million vacancies. There are plenty of jobs out there if you need or indeed want one. Now, job vacancies across the UK are being filled at record rates, with the average time taken to fill a job vacancy just 1.5 months. That's equal to its speed before the onset of the pandemic. The speed at which job vacancies are being filled suggests that record vacancies are being driven by the economy reopening, not necessarily by difficulties finding the right staff. And that, from an economic perspective, is a positive sign. Now, the Resolution Foundation surveyed 6,060 workers back in mid-October. They found that 88% of furloughed employees in late September were subsequently employed in October. And that's a good result. It seems to be shown in this new ONS jobs data. We were probably right to fear mass resignations when furlough came to an end. But with hindsight, this decision by Chancellor Rishi Sunak to close the scheme for good in September was absolutely the right move. Of course, one drawback of this relatively low level of post-furlough redundancies is that the million-plus job vacancies out there are not being filled as easily as they would have otherwise been, because there aren't people who are made redundant looking for new jobs who can go and fill those vacancies. If most of those job vacancies have to be filled by people leaving other roles, resigning, being part of that great resignation, then of course that's creating more job vacancies for each vacancy that gets filled. So that is problematic. Now, according to the Resolution Foundation, while the UK job market is looking more resilient this autumn, the outlook for pay packets is more troubling. Average weekly earnings growth was 4.9% between July and September. That's still, of course, distorted by the impact of the pandemic. The ONS is forecasting pay growth as low as 3.4% next year, and that suggests we're going to see a real terms fall in earnings because price inflation is expected to climb towards 4% by the end of this year. In other words, you're going to be poorer in real terms thanks to prices rising faster than wages. But do keep in mind these are average prices and average wages we're talking about. You don't need to be average. One option you've got is to get a pay rise, either with your existing employer or by moving to a new employer, because remember, you're in demand. And there are, of course, steps you can take to protect your finances from rising prices, as I outlined in the video I'll link to up here. Now, the latest price inflation figures are due to be released tomorrow morning. I'm going to be on BBC Radio, shortly after that release, 7 a.m, to chat about them. Right now, as I record this, the City expects Consumer Prices Index, or CPI inflation, to come in at 4% for this year to October. That's up from 3.1% a month earlier. It's a decent leap in price inflation, and it would represent twice the Bank of England target at 2%. It's bound to place some more pressure on the bank's Monetary Policy Committee and more pressure to hike interest rates when they get together again in mid-December, if that CPI figure does materialise at 4% there or thereabouts in the morning. And it could even lead to inflation forecasts for next year being revised even higher. Nye Comenetti, who's senior economist at the Resolution Foundation, said the furlough scheme has kept a lid on unemployment throughout the pandemic, but many have feared that its closure on 30th of September would spark a fresh labour market shock. But early indications are that the UK jobs market has remained resilient, with record vacancies and job moves, and withstood the withdrawal of emergency support well. But while unemployment is unlikely to be a problem this winter, pay may well be. The economy needs Goldilocks pay growth, fast enough to protect living standards, but not so fast as to generate excessive inflation. And that's a really, really important point from Nye Comenetti here, because actually all these job vacancies and this great resignation that's taking place and this expectation that workers hold all the cards, that could well fuel further price inflation, because if workers are going out there and demanding pay rises, or they're switching roles and being paid more, that creates more money in the economy, and that could drive to more demand, that could drive to higher prices. Look, I guess the key messages from this data are the UK economy probably isn't doing as bad as we thought it could be at this stage in the cycle, and employees are holding more of the cards than they were at the start of last year. It's a good time to be in work or looking for work. There are some challenges around price inflation, but that's not going to come as a shock to anyone, particularly anyone who watches these videos. But there is also an opportunity, I think, for some strong wage growth to offset those higher prices for goods and services, as long as it doesn't sort of fuel higher prices and become a bit of a repeating cycle, higher wages, higher prices, but we'll see. Now, what do you make of these latest jobs figures? I'd love to hear from you in the comments, especially if you have participated in the Great Resignation. Have you switched jobs this year? I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Thank you for watching this video. Until next time, I'm Martin Bamford, and remember, when it comes to your money, the more you know, the faster it can grow.